So our second panel really follows, I think, nicely from our first one in the sense that, or at least conceptually follows from the first one. If the first one was kind of a broad's eye view of the future of universities or the potential futures of universities, and I thought to think through that question further, it would be particularly helpful to represent, and I don't mean to pigeonhole our panelists and what they need to represent, but to at least start to think about two parts of the university that exist, and I think in a complex and emerging relationship to the larger university, and that would be engineering and civic centers. That universities increasingly have these, I mean, they've had engineering for a while, but I think we know at places like UT Austin, OSU, UVA, that we've just heard represented, that engineering is a powerful force on the campus, and civic centers are a somewhat new force and maybe a contested force. And so I wanted to think a bit about what the university experience is in light of people that have familiarity with both of these worlds. So, the guiding question for the panel: how can large public institutions bridge interests ranging from engineering to the liberal arts? Can civic education create common ground in that world? And I should say, to speak about that, we have Samuel Goldman, Associate Professor of the Humanities in the Hamilton School for Civic and Classical Education at the University of Florida. Like me, you may have learned a great deal from his public-facing commentary over the years on the politics of higher education. And then Erhardt Graeff, who is Associate Professor of Social and Computer Science at the Olin College of Engineering, and also has worked, I think, extensively with the Agra Institute at Johns Hopkins. I saw him a few weeks ago at a conference on civic education at Tufts. So both Sam and Erhardt are really thinking about the relationship between these different units and this larger world of civic education and the larger university. And so I think there's a great deal to learn from both of them. And so we'll go again in alphabetical order. And so we'll begin with Professor Goldman and then Professor Graeff.
Thanks, Jeremy. I must confess, I accepted the invitation to discuss this with a certain trepidation because it's not a subject on which I have systematic and well-developed thoughts. Needless to say, all of my opinions are correct, but there are differences in the precision of my correct opinions, and these lie at the broader and more blurry end of that spectrum. You will notice in a few minutes that Erhardt will present a PowerPoint. I'm not going to do that. Partly, I think, as a disciplinary difference from which we might learn something, but also because my own thinking is not sufficiently elaborated to do that. So what I'm going to present are some starting points for considering the relation between civic centers and schools or programs in engineering. At the same time, I'm not altogether without experience in this area. I tried unsuccessfully to establish a program in something like science, technology, and society at my former employer. I emphasize unsuccessfully, so I have tried to learn from my own failure, and perhaps you can too. Also, the Hamilton School, like many of the civic centers, is beginning the process of thinking about how it might cooperate with other units, including engineering. So what I'm going to present are 4 points of contact, or possible points of contact, between civic centers and engineering programs. And the first, and I think this reflects some of the issues that were raised in the previous discussion, is that both civic centers and engineering schools stand outside much of the prevailing disciplinary architecture. And that makes faculty and administrators in both willing to experiment, or at least to consider different ways of doing things. My experience at GW, where again I failed to establish the program that I proposed, was that colleagues in other fields, especially in the humanities, were crippled by the inertia that Chad Wellman described in his remarks, and that inertia took two overlapping forms. One was an unbreakable commitment to the various administrative procedures and requirements that have accreted over the last half century and more. And of course, one realizes that universities have rules and there are certain ways that you have to do things. That's fine. Those rules and procedures should not be ends in themselves. And what I encountered, and I don't think it was a unique experience, is that too often they were regarded that way. More generally, I have found that academic humanists, even though they know in the abstract that our current disciplinary setup is contingent and in some ways arbitrary, we don't have to have the departments we have in the relations that they have. It's very, very difficult for them to think about any other forms of organization. They take these conventional disciplinary distinctions really as the basic units of their professional reality. And as some of you have encountered, that is an obstacle to the development of the civic centers. I have found that colleagues in engineering and to a lesser extent the natural sciences are less committed to that. So there is a perhaps somewhat unexpected, but I think nevertheless fruitful affinity here between units that for different reasons and in different ways are willing to consider new forms of academic organization. There's also, I think, an affinity in the role of practice in civic and engineering education. Both of these fields aim at doing something, knowing something, yes, but knowing something in order to build something or make something or participate in something. This is sometimes stylized as the theoretical versus applied sciences. I actually think that's wrong. And one of the areas in which we might make progress is challenging that distinction. Rather, I think that the civic centers and engineering programs, at least as they should be organized, aim at cultivating a kind of what Aristotle called practical wisdom. And practical wisdom rejects a sharp separation of knowing and doing. It's rather the idea that you can gain through experience and through the pursuit of concrete ends in the world a certain kind of knowledge that is different to what you might learn through purely theoretical reflection or from books. In the civic centers, the ideal here is a form of responsible citizenship or even statesmanship. I am myself a little bit of a skeptic about the rhetoric of statesmanship because, you know, most of us and most of our students are not going to become statesmen and women. It's hard enough to be good citizens. But even then, the idea is that you develop a certain kind of practical wisdom that allows one to apply universal principles to particular situations in ways that don't admit of mathematical proof. And although a great deal of engineering does involve issues of mathematical proof, not all of them do. And turning to the third point, I think this is one of the things that civic centers and civic education can teach engineers and potential engineers. Engineers, in my experience talking to them, are sometimes inclined to think that technological forms are neutral, and their job is simply to build what they are told to build, or to make what they are told to make, and to do the appropriate calculations so the bridge doesn't collapse or whatever it may be. And you know, there's an element of truth in that. But engineering projects and I mean this in a very concrete sense, are not neutral. The classic example of this is the federal highway system, which is a marvel of engineering and does, or did as it was being constructed, invoke some classic engineering problems. How will you build the road most efficiently from point A to point B? But also drew on fundamentally political questions. Where should you build this road? What happens if there is something in the way of the road that has to be removed? Should you go around, or should you knock down the obstacle and build right through it? There is a version of the engineering response, which would be, those are not engineering questions. Those are not my problem. Those are issues to be decided by public authorities of one kind. I don't think those questions can be settled so neatly. It seems important to me that engineers and future engineers have some practice in reflecting on the implications of their work and the processes of decisions that can lead to the choice to build a bridge here and not there. And civic centers with well-designed curricula, I don't have one yet to give you, perhaps Erhardt does, I think can help to cultivate that form of awareness and reasoning. I can give another example of where this has gone very badly wrong. It's not, strictly speaking, in engineering schools, but I think it's relevant to the sort of technological perspective that can dominate there, which is the management of the pandemic just a few years ago, where in this case, scholars of public health and epidemiology seemed utterly unable to conceive that their recommendations and analyses might involve important trade-offs that would have to be debated and evaluated. And instead of having the sort of meaningful and necessarily wrenching public discussion of these questions that I think we deserved, there was a perverse interaction of technical and political authorities, where the technical authorities would say, well, you know, we're just calculating rates of infection here. We're not making decisions about what policies should be adopted. And then the politicians, probably in many of the places you live, certainly the one where I live, Washington, D.C., said, oh no, we're just doing what the technicians told us. That, I think, was one of the major causes of the continuing populist and anti-professional revolt that we are experiencing. I don't imagine that the right set of classes would have prevented it entirely, but experts and would-be experts need not have been as blindsided as they were. And this is something that I think civic centers can help with. And I should say, and here I return to the positive side of my experiences at GW, I found that many of the faculty and leaders of the engineering school were actually quite aware of this problem and were eager to address it. I found greater obstacles on the humanities side, where there was a real resistance to thinking about genuine intellectual exchange, rather than simply, bringing our precious treasures to the barbarians. So that's something that I think engineering schools or programs might be able to learn from the civic centers. For my fourth and final point, I'll just mention an area where I think the civic centers could learn from engineering programs. And this is a bit of a self-indictment, since one of the things that I teach in my career as an academic and intellectual dilettante is the American political tradition. And often when we, or not to include others in my own shortcomings, I teach the American political tradition, that happens is that we concentrate excessively on political theory, basically. We teach Locke, we teach Jefferson, we teach Madison, and those are all important things to do. But one of the really striking and distinctive features of the American political tradition, going all the way back to the 18th century, has been the enthusiasm for engineering and technology as a part of a flourishing modern republic. Benjamin Franklin, of course, is the symbol of this with his experiments. I guess their scientific value is perhaps debatable, but their symbolic value is enormous. That Franklin became the first world-famous American as an amateur engineer. And then more concretely, in the promotion to technological innovation through the patent and copyright system, which is written into the Constitution. Since the foundation of the American Republic and before, building things and making things has been regarded as a really important part of what it means to be an American and what it would mean for the United States to succeed. And I plead guilty myself to forgetting that. I think that's something that engineering programs could teach us. And that's not just a lesson to be learned at the abstract level. If you are teaching something like the history of 19th century America or the United States before the Civil War, if you are teaching that without close attention to engineering and technology, you are missing an enormous part of the story. And we are doing our own students who are not going to become engineers but want to learn something about the country in which they live and where they will be called to exercise the privileges of citizenship. To leave that out of the story does a disservice to them. So once again, these are merely starting points. I don't have a curriculum to present to you, and at Hamilton, I and others are just at the beginning of thinking this through. But the bottom line that I want to conclude with is that this is not just a shotgun marriage in which these slightly odd units that in different ways, again, are sort of marginal to the core faculty of arts and sciences, which is at least notionally the heart of the university in most cases. The reality, as both Chad Wellman and Steve Mintz describe, is often rather different. There are genuine points of contact, and we are more likely to be successful in our efforts to cooperate if we can find real affinities rather than just playing the administrative angles.
Thanks so much, Sam, and I'll let Erhardt claim the podium. Great.
Oh, I've got a slide. All right. That's a good start. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to talk to you about this. So, my name's Erhardt Graeff. I teach at a college of engineering. It is an entire university, or in this case, a small liberal arts style college that is dedicated to teaching engineering. We have only engineering students. And I teach in both engineering as well as in the social sciences. And so I have an interdisciplinary background. And I hope today to offer a bit of a vision of what that integration of civics education and engineering looks like, as we had just kind of heard what those common touch points might be. So for the past 7 years, I've been teaching courses that are specifically designed to do civic education with my students. So I do topic-focused courses like a first-year distributional requirement option called Democracy and Media. I also recently created a elective on local democracy. And I've also taught in our basic software design course, as well as our capstone design course. And I'm going to talk about some of those examples today. I'm really grateful to be teaching at Olin. for a number of reasons. One is that we only have 400 students total. We were started specifically as an experimental college to push the envelope on what engineering education should look like. So we're well positioned to look at new models. And we have no departments. All of our faculty are within one interdisciplinary body, which also allows us to have some of those kind of nice interactions that might not otherwise occur. So I want to offer four things in my remarks today. One is a description of what can happen to engineers' civic identities and commitments during undergrad, which presents us with a challenge. Two, a recommendation for using project-based learning as civic pedagogy. And three, a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. And then I'll end by attempting to synthesize these ideas for all of you. So I'm starting with an idea, that was the slide that just went away, that's been kind of central to how I think about this, which really starts with Alexis de Tocqueville. And that he noted that civic and political associations were both unusually common in the United States and served as excellent spaces for citizens to cultivate the skills and character necessary for self-government. It's often referred to as free schools in many translations. He also looked at New England town halls. Yay, okay, we got slides. Are we going back? It's all happening. So let me finish this thought, and then I'll move on to the challenge, because that's the slide we found ourselves on. So I do think that free school civics, as a project-based approach to civic education, is really powerful. A well-designed project in the classroom or in the community can be a free school of democracy in that same sense, a place where students practice the habits of self-government, and until those habits can be incorporated into their personal and professional identities. This is not a substitute for reading texts of our civic tradition, but represents a setting where the ideas those texts offer get exercised on real problems with real people. So, here's an empirical finding that I think deserves some note. The sociologist Aaron Seck published a study in 2014 that tracked engineering students at 4 institutions: MIT, UMass Amherst, Smith College, and my own, Olin. They looked at them from first year through 4th year and even beyond. They were measuring 4 specific beliefs that those students held at those time points: how important students thought it was for a successful engineering career to involve professional and ethical responsibility, understanding the consequences of technology, understanding how people use machines, and social consciousness. What she found was that across all 4 schools, including the 2 explicitly designed to produce what she called a new kind of engineer, student commitments of these four beliefs declined over 4 years. Not because students stopped caring about these things as people, but because these concerns became less central to their professional identity as engineers, which Seck attributes to what she calls a culture of disengagement in engineering and engineering education. Cultural features of the profession transmitted through socialization. I want to pause here because I don't want to misread this with all of you. It's not an argument that engineers are morally deficient and need to be rescued by the humanities. What it documents is that engineering students are actually whole people who arrive at their institutions with civic and ethical commitments. In fact, in my own experience, many of the students show up in engineering because they believe that they can do a lot of good for the world, in addition to earning a living. However, 4 years of engineering education can quietly narrow their professional identity in ways that leave their broader civic and ethical commitments stranded outside their work. Now, whether or not we want civic and professional identities to become deeply integrated, and I'll be transparent that that is my project. I am trying to do that at Olin. There is a more basic thing that Seck's data tells us. Engineering students are not getting asked the civic questions often enough or necessarily in the right way to keep those questions salient during their formation as engineers, and that's a gap civic education can address. Seck's data also actually is encouraging on this point. She notes that programs that explicitly emphasize ethical and social issues, policy implications, general education, and writing actually predict stronger public welfare commitments in their students. Culture building and intentional emphasis matter, courses matter. That's the opening for, I think, what we're trying to do here today. So, how should we teach? Engineers learn by doing. They come to fundamental concepts through challenges and exploring complex systems. Their curiosity is activated by how does this work, and why is this broken, and how might we fix it? That's often framed as narrowly technical, but I don't think it is. It's actually deeply human orientation. Curiosity about a concrete problem, and that I think civic educators can work with that. Project-based learning is what I'm going to talk about here. It's usually thought of as a technical pedagogy, but I want to argue it's also one of the most powerful humanistic pedagogies available to us, especially for STEM students. Here's why. A good project starts with a question that the student genuinely wants to answer. That question pulls them into reading, history, context. They need the context to make sense of that complex problem. A good project forces them out of their assumptions. If they're working on something outside their immediate experience, they have to reckon with social, political, historical, and economic contexts that they might otherwise skip past. And a good project generates reflection almost automatically. Students begin asking, who am I in this situation? What's my role? What are my responsibilities? And those are civic questions. They arrive at those questions when the project is designed well as when it is scaffolded by mentors and by prompts for reflection. In other words, a well-designed project can be transformative learning experience that cultivates civic mindsets, as philosopher of education Carolyn Kraber recommends in her very interesting book. She builds on Jack Mesereau's transformative learning tradition and Ronald Barnett's concept of strangeness to argue that students can pursue authenticity, which she defines very closely to Aristotelian flourishing, by navigating the strangeness produced by super complex encounters that challenge and prompt reorientation of a person's assumptions, beliefs, and values. I want to be clear, this is not a downgrade from close reading or the study of foundational texts. Deep reading of a complex text is itself an encounter with difficulty, and engineering students can benefit from it, especially since their training rarely asks them to do it. In my Democracy and Media course, I ask students to read multiple original texts for this exact reason. But I pair that close reading with a project. And that allows students to have to enact the ideas that they're reading about. It creates a form of learning that lives in their bodies and their identities in a way that reading alone sometimes doesn't. The reading tells them what a civic idea is. The project shows them what it asks and expects of them and of society in practice. So let me sketch this out, what this can look like for some of the engineers that I have taught. Here's a concrete example from the capstone design course that I've taught at Olin, which is called Design Justice Studio, was formerly called Affordable Design and Entrepreneurship. This is one of the capstone design courses Olin students can choose from. Most engineering programs have a capstone design course. It's often required by the accreditor. These can look in different ways. In this case, students work on multi-year teams that are co-designing solutions with community organizations. Students can enroll and join a team for up to 3 semesters. The projects themselves often run for 5 or more years, carried forward by the faculty who has that long-standing relationship. So my project was called the Rights and Privacy Team, which I created and mentored from fall 2019 to spring 2024. So their charge on that team was working on the criminal legal system. We engaged with several different potential partners and learned about the space before landing on a specific project, which was building a data tool to help public defenders challenge pretextual traffic stops, which are a major entry point to incarceration, especially for people of color. The tool generated standardized reports on officers' citation histories, and by the time the team handed the tool off to the public defender's office in spring 2024, the reports were being hosted on a statewide database that defense attorneys could access for their cases. That's the engineering outcome. What I really want to share is the example of the civic education that happened alongside that. So the team had 2 kinds of partners. On one side, the state public defender's office, where they built the tool to be used. On the other side, a community-based, very close to abolitionist organization, which was deeply connected to the people most affected and had folks who had been system evolved among their members. These folks included many who were skeptical of the public defender's office and whose theory of change ran through grassroots organizing and media advocacy rather than through the courts or through policy. The teams of students spent several years holding these 2 partnerships simultaneously, and they had to work through questions that are among the hardest of democratic life. What does solidarity mean when your partners disagree about fundamental political ends? What do you owe to a partner whose theory of change you're not sure you share? Is building a tool that helps the existing legal system reformist work, or is it a way of extending a system that some of your partners want to dismantle? And when's it time to end a partnership? How do you do it with integrity? Not ghosting one partner because the other is closer to where the technical work landed, but acknowledging the relationship, the debt, and the disagreement honestly. These are not questions that we put on any syllabus. They are questions the students raised, documented, and carried forward across multiple cohorts over the years. Every semester, the outgoing team ends up writing what they call a love letter to the incoming team, a reflection on what they've learned, what they still don't know, and what they want their successors to carry forward. The spring 2024 letter really reads like a civic document. The students reckon honestly with the limits of their expertise, with the tensions between their partners, with the fact that they may never know whether their tool actually reduces incarceration, and with the weight of ending the partnership with community organizers after years of that relationship. The handoff is also worth naming here. The tool had to be designed to be sustainable in the hands of an institution with its own capacity constraints and priorities. The students had to let go of control, pass on documentation, trust the receiving institution, and accept that their work was now part of something that they no longer directly shaped. When I read that letter, I see engineers who can talk about their role in society with sophistication, with reflexivity, and with curiosity. They can articulate what they did technically, but what it also meant politically, what they're uncertain about, and what they owe the people that they worked with. That, I'd suggest, is a very good outcome for civic education with engineers. This kind of long-running community-engaged project is, I would say, the gold standard. It's an ideal. And it's something that Carolyn Kraber argues in her book is really what we should be aiming for, and also what service learning has been doing for years, and the advocates will tell you as much. I will also say, though, it's not the only version of this. In my classroom-based course, Democracy and Media, these are first-year students, they still do project work. I ask them to propose designs to make communities and institutions they care about more democratic. They develop and perform public narratives in the tradition of Marshall Gans. They work through cases and current events in teams. A well-designed classroom project can carry meaningful weight even when you can't get students into the field. So let's turn to what this might mean for all of you in this room who are designing courses that might be one of the few focused exposures to civic thought and practice an engineering student might get. First, your courses can use projects alongside your texts. This is a pattern across Olin, not just in my courses. Our history and literature courses, our design courses, our first-year integrated engineering, as well as humanities courses, pair sustained reading with project work that asks students to apply what they've read to real questions and real contexts. The texts give the project depth. The project gives the text urgency. Second, invite engineering students to bring their professional identity into the room rather than check it at the door. Ask them to think about Tocqueville as engineers. Ask them what Federalist 10 means for someone who will design an algorithm that shapes public discourse. Ask them what Burke has to say to someone who will build infrastructure that will outlast them by 100 years. These aren't stretches. These are the actual civic questions of our moment, and engineering students, I think, are actually uniquely positioned to engage them. Third, find partners across the university. The virtues of democratic self-governance don't automatically transfer from the seminar room into the engineering studio. If we want them to transfer, we need partners across the university who will reinforce them in the spaces engineers spend most of their time. So you need tenure track and teaching track faculty who teach those core engineering courses. You need to talk to the capstone mentors, career development and community engagement offices. You don't need to co-teach with all these folks necessarily, but you do need colleagues who can pick up the thread after your course might end. Now, Jeremy asked me to touch on measurement, and I want to take a moment on this because I think it's one of the most important and underinvested parts of this work. Start by aligning what you assess with what you're trying to cultivate. We use a framework at Olin. The shorthand is GAPA, Goals, Activities, Products, Assessments, which forces you to ask, if this is what I want students to learn, what will they do to learn it? What will they produce? And how will I know whether they've learned it? One reasonable, meaningful, and accessible target might just be, can students talk about their role in society as both engineers and citizens with sophistication, reflexivity, and curiosity? That's something you could look for in different reflective artifacts, essays, letters, public narratives like I teach. Civic formation also isn't a single horizon outcome. A student's capacity to reflect on their role in society at the end of your course is one data point. Their capacity at graduation is another data point. Their capacity at 5 or 10 years is, once again, more data points, and arguably more important ones, because that is when the muscles you help them develop are either being used or may have atrophied. This kind of longitudinal assessment is not something any one faculty member can do alone. It requires partnerships inside your institution that may not yet exist. Your institutional research office could be able to help you design measures and collect data across cohorts. Your careers office may be able to help you track what kinds of work your students are entering and what skills they report drawing on. Your alumni affairs office can help you field surveys that ask graduates 5 and 10 years out what they do in their work and civic lives, what capacities they rely on, and where they trace those capacities back in their undergraduate experience, perhaps curricular or extracurricular. This is actually something my Olin colleague, Georgia Van de Zandt, has been studying with her students and running those surveys with our alumni. When those results come back, you may find that your first-year civics course or a capstone partnership mattered more than you even dreamed. You may also find that it didn't. Either way, you will know and you'll be able to work on your program design and also talk about your work with the evidence that you've assembled. We should also be honest about these time horizons, since civic capacities may not pay off in the first job, but may pay off in the 10 or 20 years into that career when a former student is the one deciding how a system can get built. And I think in an era when professional skills are being disrupted by AI, the ability to understand oneself as a whole person with civic and professional identities is not a luxury. It is arguably the most durable thing we can offer our students. And that seems like a career readiness argument we should be quick to make in this room. Back to the panel question, although I think we already answered this pretty well. Can civic education create common ground between engineering and the liberal arts? I think we have to. Contemporary democracy is a socio-technical system. The social media we argue on, the voting machines we cast ballots in, the algorithms that moderate public discourse, the municipal data systems that shape how our neighborhoods are policed and governed, these are the infrastructure on which democratic life in this country is practiced. Democracy and technology have never been separable, which means humanists and engineers have a shared problem, whether maybe we chose it or not, and that is the common ground. Here is one way I would frame what that common ground is actually for. In my courses, I ask students to hold two pictures in mind at the same time. The first is the ideal, what a democratic space could look like at its best. This is where the founders of the Republic are useful, where thinkers like Habermas are useful, where the long tradition of democratic theory is trying to imagine what genuine collective self-government could look like, and then asking us to build, revise, and practice toward it. The second picture is actually existing democracy, the institutions and platforms and processes we have now, with all their distortions and shortfalls and inequities. The work of design, the work of engineering, the work of civics is to bridge the gap between those two pictures through collaborative processes and careful interventions over time. That framing lands for my engineering students and motivates them because it reads as a design problem. And it is a design problem of exactly the kind they are being trained to take seriously. And the stakes are democracy itself. I came to this work in part because 15 years ago, I witnessed firsthand people and organizations building social media platforms and claiming their tools were good for democracy. A few engineers, project managers, and designers were trying to do the work, the deep study, and the careful measurement, but those organizations have proven to be almost constitutionally careless. What I want for engineering students is that they can hold both pictures honestly, and that when they sit down to design something that will touch democratic life, they can tell the difference between what they hope they're building and what they're actually building, and have the civic skills to advocate for the better designs. Good engineering design, both good in the technical sense, as well as maybe in the Aristotelian virtue sense, is a civic skill. How are we doing on time?
Good. We have like 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I have enough time to finish. 15 years on, I'd note that the major platforms have largely given up on their democracy claims. They're still widely used for civic engagement, but without any careful design work from the people building the core products. That abandonment leaves citizens themselves to make civic use of non-ideal tools, which makes cultivating civic skills and mindsets in the general population even more important now than it has ever been. I'm glad to see that there are technologists, though, who are continuing to work on alternatives. Several are building tools aimed at getting people talking across differences in person, with technology as an aid to deliberation rather than a replacement for it. Your graduates could be among those builders, but they will be better at it if they have practiced holding the two pictures at once. My current work is increasingly in the tradition of virtue and character education. Wes, who I see in the back of the room, is one of my mentors on this, actually. This is a topic for another talk, I'll say. But I do want to say this much. I deeply believe that undergraduate teaching for engineers or anyone should be helping students examine and iterate on their definitions of the good, on the virtues that are important to them, to forge character in a way that holds across their professional, personal, and civic environments. The kind of formation happens through sustained practice and reflection of virtues over time, not simply through exposure. It requires deeper integration than any one or two courses can provide, which is why I'm working with a lot of other folks at Olin to imagine our whole program as integrating some of those approaches. It's also a good fit for projects. Exposure, though, does still matter. What you do in your courses matters. You are helping students exercise muscles they don't otherwise get to exercise on topics they might not otherwise get to meet during undergrad. This is real work and it has real effects. But I believe it comes with a responsibility, built into the missions of our higher education institutions and the civic centers assembled here. Having done that work in your classroom, you have a reason to follow up through outreach across the schools and programs of your university to keep the thread alive, to keep asking engineering students to look up from their workbench and see the broader picture. One course plants something. Whether it grows depends on whether it keeps being watered by invitations to encounter new and strange real-world experiences or prompts to reflect and share perspectives among peers. So I'll end by saying the work of cultivation across the institution is, I think, exactly what a civic center is positioned to do. You can shape your own socio-technical system, that is the university, and advocate for what is needed. I believe that is what this room is being called to do in this moment. So I thank you for your time and look forward to questions and discussion.
So let me ask you again, that if you have a question, raise your hand so the mic runners can see you, and I'll ask Sam and Erhardt if they'd like to respond to each other first.
Yeah, I'll just respond very briefly, which is that Erhardt's presentation reminds me of another function of the civic centers, and I know that Lee does not like to talk about this, but I'm on the podium, so I get to speak, which is the importance of ideological or other viewpoint diversity. The project you mentioned, Erhardt, has an implicitly sort of left reformist implication. It assumes that the goal is to help defenders and reduce incarceration. That's a legitimate view that many people have. One might also think that we should help police and prosecutors and increase incarceration. And my point, of course, is not to make an argument one way or the other on the merits, but it's actually important that civic centers include faculty who are in a position to contemplate and, if necessary, advise or promote or foster projects and activities that don't follow the usual assumptions. This is one of the classic criticisms of so-called action civics, as you know. Not an objection in principle, but the objection to the reality that is almost always the case, that action civics enterprises assume a left, progressive, often partisan, democratic orientation. I don't think that has to be the case, but it is very likely to be the case unless civic centers can present some version, again, of ideological or viewpoint diversity that is just not going to come from any other unit in the university.
Now let's open it up.
Okay, good. All right. So Chad, go ahead. Yeah.
Sam, I have a question, and I say this with all generosity, and as someone for whom Weber and Aristotle are lodestars, whether I like it or not, for me. And that is to say, like, I struggle with this myself, even though I'm not in a civic center. So I was really struck by your use of kind of an Aristotelian practical wisdom, and so my question is simply this. How are we to reconcile or conceive of certain civic centers' stated commitment to things like institutional neutrality, maybe even viewpoint diversity, politics out of the classroom? These are catchphrases that are just mostly circulating, so not necessarily with deep propositional content. et cetera. And with what you're calling forming students into a practical civic wisdom, which definitely for Aristotle, but I would just say for me, necessarily involves recognizing students stepping onto campuses already as citizens and already involved in civic political activity. So how is there, how do you reconcile the way maybe the discursive question about civic centers, what they're attached to, about these claims, and your call to, no, we're trying to form students and model ways of civic action if the presupposition is that they're spaces of neutrality or apolitical, keep politics out of the classroom kinds of things. How do you think about that? How do you see these very young, nascent centers kind of hopefully struggling with that question? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, of course, I can't speak for all the civic centers, which have different institutional statuses and different statutory missions. It's hard to generalize, but I can point out that the Hamilton School is formally a school of civic and classical education. That's our official brand established by the legislature. And I see the concept of practical wisdom as not just the conceptual overlap, but as historically the overlap between those two traditions, extending all the way back to the ancient Greeks and all the way up to the American founding and beyond. I don't see that as being in any way in tension with institutional neutrality properly understood. And this maybe is a tangent, but a lot of the criticisms of institutional neutrality are very, very abstract and sort of ideal theory, like nothing is really neutral. Yeah, of course. What institutional neutrality means is not taking unnecessary stands on controversial public issues. And I don't see any tension between avoiding that and doing what we're describing. Similarly, viewpoint diversity or whatever term one prefers, I think it is genuinely important not only for issues of public legitimacy, but for educational purposes, that there be someone at the university who can speak to, again, just using the same example, an engineering, a computer science student who says, I want to build a tool that will assist prosecutors in making their cases, and not being treated as a fascist or outcast or otherwise unworthy of participation in the academic community. So do these things fit perfectly? Maybe not, but as your own metaphor of Frankenstein's monster describes, nothing really does. Can they be stitched together in a way that is at least functional? I think and hope so, and that's what engineers do.
Grateful for this conversation. And this is a pretty nuts and bolts comment and maybe a bit of a suggestion as you're sort of mapping the space between civic centers and engineering and the sciences. When you're teaching ethics courses, there are these conspicuous moments where the pre-engineering students, the physics students, the computer science, the mathematics students emerge into the conversation. I'm thinking here of social contract tradition and game theory. You start thinking about utilitarianism and various ways of modeling well-being. You think about principles, formal principles sort of governing fairness of the allocation of resources. And in those moments, you see students who feel very comfortable deploying formal methods, thinking, I can solve these problems. They are tremendously exciting if you're teaching that broad swath of students. So thinking about this sort of general question of getting out of the model where we're sort of bringing treasures to the barbarians, I would note that as a philosopher, we have a bad track record of thinking quantitative methods are somehow inimical to shedding good light on these questions of value theory. So thinking about this curricular space and focusing on what I would describe as sort of morality meets mathematics, I think is a really interesting opportunity. And I'm curious, as you're thinking about some of the one course pieces, where opportunities would reside.
That's for you.
Yeah, it was more of a comment than a question. Is there a particular question you want to tack onto that?
So very often, in addition to the sort of project-based learning, there are engineering for ethics courses. Yeah. And, you know, these are across the curriculum, right? Engineering for kinesiologists, engineering for the business student. I mean, that's not a great space insofar as people immediately feel generally condescended to. So one thing I would think about is engineering students are really interesting. Science students are very interesting. Bringing to them these questions for civic education in philosophy and politics that let them deploy tools that feel comfortable and productive. I think the humanities have much to learn from these methods.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, one of the recommendations in my remarks was that you should make sure that you're including engineers and their professional identities in the courses. I think it's very strange to have these kind of separate courses in which it's like engineering for this or ethics for engineers. Put them all together because it's actually the interesting interactions around the different priors that these students might have coming into those courses where you can shape that through the discussions that are actually what all of the students need, right? Once again, like the problem of democracy, as many complex problems are socio-technical problems, right? And so we actually want to promote interdisciplinary thinking for students that are thinking through these challenges. And so having students that are coming from other courses in which they're tackling related problems in different ways is really, really generative. And I think that should absolutely be a design principle for our courses.
Their hands in the back, I can't see who, but.
So thanks. I found both these discussions so stimulating. This is an anecdote, not necessarily a question, but I think it sparks questions for us. So I'm a political theorist who is the daughter of an engineer, an engineering professor. And one of the things that's always really struck me as someone inclined to kind of take the political theory route that Sam was mentioning, is that my father in his teaching, he's like about to retire. He's suddenly become the most popular engineering professor on campus. And the reason for this, it seems to me, is that he always goes into the history of like thermodynamics and really is interested in the kind of the human beings who came up with these ideas. And all of the undergraduates now are sort of flocking to his seminars, which is very distressing for the department, who've been trying to sideline my father for many, many years and force him to retire. So I'm like really enjoying watching this. But it also seems to me that what's emerged here is a real need and a real kind of desire on the parts of engineering students to kind of understand what it is that they're doing. And I think also my father's probably pushing on an open door because the quality of teaching is very low in that department. So that doesn't seem to be the case at Olin. But so anyway, so I wonder if there is kind of scope there. I don't know if Civic Centers should be in the business of kind of dedicating themselves to hiring engineers because, you know, the difficulties of that are obvious. But I think that there is a kind of gap here for a civically minded kind of history of science or the history of the sciences kind of approach. And anyway, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Maybe it is just, you know, we need virtuous teachers.
All of the above, in my mind, would be helpful. I mean, I think we should be, like, even though I said you don't have to co-teach, I think co-teaching is actually a really powerful approach to this, right? Obviously, we have some folks, perhaps like your father, perhaps like me, who integrate those two kind of approaches in their teaching. And great, if you can find those folks and put them in front of students, ideally, you know, lots of engineering students, but also lots of students across the university, that's ideal. I think we see the same thing with our students in terms of the appetite for that sense of purpose about why they're learning the technical skills, right? And so engineers are not immune from, you know, what's been opined a lot lately about the, you know, chaos of purpose or like, you know, the crisis of purpose for undergraduates right now. I think they're all searching for that, and giving some history, some context to the work that you do can really support that. I think we also try to attract that in our marketing, right? Like that's something we specifically say we're trying to offer at our university. And what's interesting is our students then tell us we don't do enough of it. And so they're, even if we're trying to, create these interdisciplinary experimental approaches to teaching engineering that offer this context, it's not enough for our students. They would like even more. And so I think that could be a real opportunity for civic centers if they're looking at opportunities for partnership.
I hadn't thought about the faculty hiring before. Anyway, one more question.
Yeah, thank you both. I just want to begin first by at least naming some other projects, if you have any thoughts on them, but I thought it's worth naming. So there's a concourse program at MIT, which is more or less a first-year Great Booksy experience, which I think is an interesting model. There's also the Herbst program for engineering, ethics, and leadership at the University of Colorado Boulder. Again, both of these organized by political theorists, but with some orientation towards people in the sciences or engineering. And then also I think the concourse program at Purdue and others modeled on it, that is general education serving the entire student body, much of which is going into STEM, I think has some of these purposes. So any thoughts you have on those? My question, which in a way was related to how those are structured, is you have what I would call, civics has civic knowledge on one side, and then like civic participation or action civics on the other. I see each of you on sort of different ends of that. There's a danger of the political theorists or humanities people to be like, we don't need to acknowledge what the end point is, we're just gonna do liberal education and that will do the formation without any reference to future vocation. It'll be a space where you're free of that kind of consideration. The danger on the action civic side, which I think Sam was alluding to a little bit, is if you jump immediately into the question, what good are you going to do in the world? You might not be confident that the student has the resources or the experience of reflection to make that kind of choice, and because they literally don't know anything. They're unformed. And there's a danger in both. If you go, there's got to be some transition from one to the other. I guess I'm wondering how you see, like, what is the amount of formation? I'm more on the side of stick to the formation, that's hard enough. There's much more danger of people doing what they think is good too quickly. But I suspect you're more sympathetic to getting right down to business quickly. So I hope that was a well-formed enough question for either of you, how you think about this. Yeah.
Do you want to respond to that first before I do?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to perceive a spectrum of theory and practice, and my invocation of practical wisdom is a suggestion that there has to be some way of integrating those things. And without commenting, I just don't know enough about how well those programs work or how they're set up, so I don't know. I do think that integration should be the goal. I'm very skeptical of programs, very, very well-intentioned, that have these different components that are just sort of shackled together. And you do your intro course, or you do your ethics and blank course, and you fulfill the requirement and then move on. I know why that happens, both for administrative and financial reasons. I'm not criticizing people who've organized their efforts that way. I just don't think that works very well. So, what is the ideal balance? I don't know, and it probably differs at different institutions with different groups of students. The appeal of something like, whether it's technically action civics or not, is just that is what gets some students excited about learning, and sitting in the seminar room is just not going to work for them. It will not provide the formation that we want. So there will be different approaches at different institutions and with different constituencies. The principle that I would bear in mind for organizing them is how can we integrate the pieces so it's not just one damn thing after another, because I think that's what produces the sort of dismissive attitude, like, oh, they make me take this course, it's irrelevant to me, it's worthless, and that doesn't suit anyone's goals.
Yeah, I'll add on to that by saying that when you introduce some of these like really weighty philosophical concepts in a first year, students have nothing to connect that to, right? That kind of, that becomes effervescent for them after that first year. It has to be reinforced, and I would say that learning these things and learning to do them well and to be kind of like, a fully thought out human and citizen is not a linear process, right? Like, it involves a lot of engaging with your experience. I think one of the things we don't take seriously is the fact that most of their civic and character education happens outside of their classroom, right? In the community of the campus. I think it's a crime that we don't offer students mentorship and reflection, scaffolded mentorship and reflection while they're on internships over the summer, and then capture their experiences when they come back to campus and be in dialogue with them about that. I mean, that's where that formation of their professional and personal identities really happens. I think creating the experiential learning opportunities within the four walls of the course allows us to scaffold that in certain ways and allows them to develop some muscles about how they sort through competing values and incentives and cultures that they might be exposed to through this set of experiences in all parts of their life, and hopefully allows them to then grow in productive and character cultivating ways.
Thanks so much, Erhardt. Since we're behind on time, I have to both end things and insist that we reconvene at 11:30 sharp. So consider this more of a 5-minute break than a 10-minute break. But it's just so that the whole day doesn't get thrown off. But thank you so much, and I really appreciate both of your remarks. It was very illuminating.